Thank you. It's really great to be here today, and it's wonderful not only to see so many friends and colleagues, but also to welcome Alexander Clement to Washington for this occasion. I'm so glad that you were able to join us, and it's great to have you here. It's been not so long ago that we were meeting in your office in Vienna, so it's great to see you here. Whoops, I managed to turn off this. That's probably all right. It's kind of, frankly, it's a bit nerve-wracking to see my picture up there. How do I get it back? All right, just leave it? Okay, all right. Actually, I wanted to point to that picture to make the case that for all of you who are already working here in government, you realize that any accomplishment is the result of teamwork. And that picture had me in it, but it also had a big team of people who were involved in negotiation of the New START treaty. So I wanted to just start out by saying very briefly that I appreciate the teamwork that I see every day here in the Department of State in the T family, as we call it, the Arms Control Bureau, ISN, the Nonproliferation Bureau, and the Bureau of Political Military Affairs. And again, if you've been spending the summer with us as an intern, you are aware how we throw you into the fray, and you get to be part of the team. So I just wanted to say a thank you right up front. And thank you also for the introduction, Abby. It's really, really great that I was introduced by the youngest member of the T front office. And we have a few folks from the Oregon Trail generation, but Abby is our millennial. She and so many of you will carry on the work that is being done today to reduce and eliminate nuclear weapons and the nuclear threat. This is an auspicious date today, as you no doubt have heard from other speakers. In some ways, the shadows that followed the Trinity flash have never left us. The nuclear age, complex and dangerous, really began that day, as did the moral, political, and technical debates that are inextricably linked to nuclear weapons. Over the past 70 years, we have seen crises unfold, debates intensify, arsenals built, proxy wars waged, treaties signed, stockpiles reduced, and walls destroyed. The world leaders that came before us played their part. Now it's up to us. It's up to you. It has been 6 years since President Obama laid out his vision for the peace and security of a world free of nuclear weapons, and it's perhaps fitting that we sit here 70 years to the day since the Trinity test, 4 floors below the headquarters of the Manhattan Project, discussing how the next generation of American and international leaders creates a world without nuclear weapons. I'm very glad that you were all able to hear yesterday from Undersecretary Sherman and Colin Kahl. The Iran deal was a truly amazing diplomatic feat. After years of negotiations, the United States, together with our international partners, achieved something that decades of animosity has not: a comprehensive long-term deal with Iran that will prevent it from obtaining nuclear weapons. This deal meets every single one of the bottom lines that we established when we achieved a framework earlier in the spring. Every pathway to a nuclear weapon is cut off, and the inspection and transparency regime necessary to verify that objective will be put in place. With full implementation, the agreement we've reached will bring insight and accountability to Iran's nuclear program, not for a small number of years, but for the lifetime of that program. There's more work ahead, but as Secretary Kerry said, this deal is a step away from the specter of conflict and toward the possibility of peace. Even with this welcome news, it should be clear that from these 2 days that we have a lot of work to do. Even sitting here for the end of this session, I was sorry I could not get down earlier. It's very clear that there is a lot of work to do in the aftermath of the Nonproliferation Treaty Review Conference. The United States' responsible approach to arms control and disarmament has already led to major reductions in nuclear weapons, fissile material stocks, and the infrastructure of our nuclear complex. These efforts have led us to reduce our nuclear arsenal by approximately 85% from the Cold War heights. In real numbers, that means that we have gone from 31,255 nuclear weapons in our active stockpile in 1967. Can you imagine that? 31,000 weapons, over that number? Why did we need to build so many? Did we think about it then? I guess we must have. But today, we are down to 4,717 in 2014. That is still too many weapons, and we know it, and we will continue to push forward with further reductions. But nevertheless, it is a significant reduction from the height of the Cold War in the mid-60s. The New START Treaty, which has now celebrated its 4th anniversary, is enhancing security and strategic stability between the United States and Russia. Both nations, I'm happy to tell you, are faithfully implementing the New START Treaty despite the crisis between Russia and really the rest of the world in terms of what is going on in Ukraine. Current tensions with the Russian Federation highlight the durability of the verification regime and the important confidence that is provided by data exchanges and on-site inspections under the treaty, as well as the security and predictability provided by verifiable mutual limits on strategic weapons. I cannot stress this point enough. 18 times a year, we are able to go to Russian strategic nuclear facilities and inspect their systems. And 18 times a year, they can come here to the United States and do the same. That, along with the thousands of notifications that we exchange day in, day out about the status of our nuclear forces, creates a real-time picture of our respective deployments. At a time when trust has been very difficult, frankly, the New START Treaty allows us to continue to have some mutual confidence. Using the employment guidance for the Nuclear Posture Review, President Obama determined that we can ensure the security of the United States, our allies and partners, and maintain a strong and credible strategic deterrent while safely pursuing up to a 1/3 reduction in deployed strategic nuclear weapons from the level established in the New START Treaty. Following that assessment, in June of 2013, now 2 years ago, President Obama in Berlin stated that the United States is willing to negotiate with the Russian Federation a reduction of up to 1/3 of our deployed strategic warheads from the level established in the New START Treaty. That offer is still on the table, and it is a good one for both parties. But progress requires a willing partner and a conducive strategic environment. Everyone here knows that the environment is not great, due not only to the Russian Federation's actions in Ukraine, but also its noncompliance with the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. Addressing both situations is an ongoing process. With specific regard to the Russian INF violation, we will continue engaging the Russian government to resolve U.S. concerns. Our objective is for Russia to return to verifiable compliance with its INF treaty obligations, as the treaty is in our mutual security interest and in the interest of every country on the globe. Even with our current problems, and actually I would say even more so because of them, the United States is committed to maintaining strategic stability between the U.S. and Russia, and we support continuing dialogue aimed at fostering a more stable, resilient, and transparent security relationship. Of course, I want to be very clear, as the United States considers any arms control priorities, we will continue to consult closely with our allies and partners. Their security and defense is non-negotiable, as well as ours. On the multilateral disarmament front, I'll just briefly touch on a few things. We continue discussions with our P5 partners, China, France, Russia, and the United Kingdom. As you know, we had our 6th P5 conference in London back in February, and just last Friday, as Adam already mentioned, we met again with the P5 in Paris for very positive discussions. Looking in from the outside, it might seem that progress is slow in this format, but I can assure you that this is how we are going to build the bridges to a multilateral disarmament process going forward. Slowly, but so very surely, we can build the foundation on which future multilateral disarmament agreements will be based. Further, as we consider future reductions, our focus must be on achievable and verifiable measures that all interested parties, nuclear states and non-nuclear states alike, can trust. That is why we recently started the International Partnership for Nuclear Disarmament Verification, which brings countries together to develop the best techniques and tools for monitoring nuclear stockpiles at lower numbers. That is why we need smart, bright, young people to enter this field. We need your help, so that we can together build the tools that will help the world get to zero nuclear weapons in a verifiable manner. The United States is expanding public outreach and building grassroots support for the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. We will not be setting any deadlines for moving forward with a vote on Capitol Hill, but we know that the CTBT is good for America's national security, and that's why we will continue educating the country on the treaty's value. You heard about the good work our labs are doing to support this treaty. We are also committed to making sure that information about the CTBT gets well out beyond the Beltway. That is why over the next 6 months, I will personally be traveling to the U.S. states that were affected by nuclear explosive testing in the period when we have been conducting testing. Of course, it's important to bear in mind that we've had a moratorium in place since 1992. And I always like to remind people that the last country that has conducted a nuclear test in this century was North Korea. So it's a remarkable, I think, fact that we have been able to sustain and maintain this moratorium. Alexander mentioned that the next step in nuclear disarmament has not moved forward, but I see new hope, frankly, for negotiation of a fissile material cutoff treaty. There have been quite some substantive discussions going on in a group of government experts. They're moving now forward with further discussions in the Conference on Disarmament. FMCT is an essential and logical next step in disarmament, and we really must move forward with it. Of course, progress on disarmament is not limited to treaties. The United States takes what I like to call a full spectrum approach to disarmament, and this approach encompasses progress on eliminating fissile material also. The work that we have been doing as part of the Nuclear Security Summit process has been instrumental to ensuring the safety and security of people around the world. And indeed, Adam mentioned the very good meeting that was held in Vilnius a couple of weeks ago to get together the so-called Sherpas in planning the next Nuclear Security Summit that will take place here in Washington at the end of March 2016. So we are really pressing ahead also on minimizing the use of fissile material around the world and ensuring its elimination, as well as, where it remains, its very secure protection, control, and accounting. Through our collective efforts, we have increased global engagement on this critical issue and in turn decreased the amount of vulnerable HU and plutonium worldwide, as well as the number of facilities where such material is kept. We have many of the remaining facilities storing weapons-usable fissile material. For many of them, we have actually upgraded physical protection and security to keep them resistant to a variety of threats. These and other summit efforts have reduced the risk that fissile material will fall into the wrong hands, fall into terrorist hands. But I think an important point to focus on is that nuclear security work is never, ever finished. You have to keep your eye on that ball all the time. As long as nuclear and radioactive materials exist, they require our utmost commitment to their protection. If you're looking for job security, nuclear security is a good place to hang your hat. Finally, it's important that people outside this room are aware that the nuclear sword of Damocles, as President John F. Kennedy called it so eloquently, still hangs above the head of every man, woman, and child on this planet. That concept has weighed heavy on the hearts and minds of U.S. leaders since the dawn of the nuclear age. Our deep understanding of the humanitarian consequences has become and will always be inseparable from our nuclear policy. It's in our interests that the 70-year history of non-use of nuclear weapons be sustained and maintained forever. I want to leave you with some final thoughts, a confession, really. I am a stone-cold, dyed-in-the-wool optimist. It is true. I am not, however, an optimist by choice. I am an optimist by necessity. As someone who has devoted her career to reducing the threats posed by nuclear weapons, there is no alternative. It is simply unthinkable. That means there is no room for cynicism, despair, or pessimism. That is what I think about when I look at the tasks in front of me and my colleagues, whether they involve the next steps in nuclear reductions, ending nuclear explosive testing worldwide, or keeping nuclear material out of the hands of terrorists. We will succeed because we absolutely must succeed. There is no alternative. Trust me, you will too. All you need is hard work, patience, and persistence. And I must say, especially on those late nights up in New York, a dash of humor helps too. So I advise you to keep that in mind always. So thank you all very much for being here today. I hope you've enjoyed these last 2 days. For those of you who will be joining us at George Washington University tomorrow, I will see you there. I will actually be opening up that session there, and so look forward to a very active and useful day there too as well. But look forward to your questions, and thank you very much for your attention. Thank you. Okay, questions. Comes one. Hi.
I'm Ruby, and I'm an intern at the State Department. I was just wondering, I know that Wendy Sherman and the Secretary just returned from negotiating the Iran deal, but as somebody who negotiated the New START deal and has engaged in, I don't know, similar negotiations, whether you could shed any light on maybe the differences with the challenges faced between the two sets of, I guess it's not a treaty, but the two sets of arms control arrangements, and if you have any ideas about that at all.
Yeah, that's actually a very good question because it allows me to talk about the difference between bilateral and multilateral diplomacy. You may have seen some of the pictures of the plenary meetings in Vienna where, you know, they had very big groups, and I don't know, it was a 6+1 format, so, you know, I don't know, they needed more than 4 sides of a table, and it was really an amazing set of moving discussion groups. I was talking to my counterpart, Deputy Foreign Minister Rybkov, who had, you know, just a couple of weeks ago, they had a technical team in Moscow to discuss aspects of, you know, what the technical responsibilities were that the Russians were going to be taking on. So a lot of moving parts in a multilateral negotiation, very, very complex, very, very important to be able to, you know, strike the right consensus compromises among all groups. So it is more, I would say, complicated in some ways. On the bilateral front, working with whatever country, it can also be very complicated, as I can attest. I used to joke all the time that I never knew what was more complicated, negotiating with the Russians or negotiating with the Senate over the New START treaty. But as a matter of fact, the you know, issues were so high stakes in the case of nuclear arms reduction starting in the early 1970s when we first engaged on nuclear arms control with the Russians that there's always a great intensity. There's always many, many difficult issues that have to be confronted and addressed, but it is a two-player game instead of a multiplayer game. So it's there's a different dynamic there and a different set of problems that have to be addressed. So I would say those were probably the biggest differences. The other thing I would say, because we've had this 45-year history of arms limitation and reduction talks with the Russian Federation, Soviet Union before that, we have a long-established working relationship with them where we understand the technical details. They know many of the details of our nuclear weapons systems, our delivery vehicles, and so forth. They understand a lot about how we do things, how we operate. And so that kind of foundation of basic understanding serves the negotiators well, I think. One final point I'll make on this, which is kind of a general point, is that negotiations have really sped up over recent years, and they've been facilitated greatly by things that are so simple as email, or having the opportunity to have somebody's cell phone number and send somebody an SMS message and say, hey, you want to get together for coffee. You know, when I first started on the START delegation back in 1990 in Geneva as a very, very junior member of the U.S. delegation, everything had to go through protocol channels, and it was always very, you know, because the Soviets could use that, of course, to play a delay game. Sometimes, of course, we'd play a delay game. But there were many kinds of testing and other diplomatic games that would go on just around scheduling of meetings and so forth. And if you can cut right through all of that, you know, to go right to your counterpart, then they make the decision. whether they're ready to have coffee with you or not. And I found it was very, very good, and I keep those numbers in my cell phone to this day. So it's a big difference just what the electronic revolution has done to negotiations, and I think that applies whether we're talking about bilateral or multilateral negotiations. So thanks for your question. Yes?
Yeah, hi. Well, first, a little comment about your optimism. Max Lerner was asked whether he was an optimist or a pessimist, and he said he was a possibilist. So an optimist, you think some things are going to get better, where it's possible, you think it's possible, but then you have to make it work. So maybe you're also a possibilist. Anyway, so...
Well, that goes without saying. You have to make
yeah,
it
right,
work.
right, without saying, which brings me to my... I'm not going to ask what you think. I just wanted to ask you what was your nuclear awakening, or how you became involved in this field.
Interesting. I went off to Georgetown University at the time of the first détente, and I would say my nuclear awakening was around that first détente and the strategic arms limitation talks that took place, as well as negotiation of the anti-ballistic missile treaty. I was a freshman and sophomore at Georgetown when those were being negotiated. By the way, it's the 40th anniversary today of the Soyuz Apollo, which was also one of the artifacts of that first détente, to have, you know, those kinds of cooperative ventures between us and the Soviet Union, and you know, basic research, that type of thing. That was all happening when I was an undergraduate, and so that's what first caught my attention, first caught my interest. If you back it up even further, I won't say that when I was 4 years old I became gripped by nuclear weapons, but I was gripped by the Sputnik launch. And that's actually a story I like to tell. I grew up in Columbus, Ohio. My dad took me out on the front porch and said, "See that little light moving across the sky? The Russians he never called them the Soviets, he always called them the Russians. The Russians put a Sputnik up in the sky." None of us knew what that meant, of course, but you know, it did lead to a lot of excitement about the possibilities for science and technology, and a lot of concern, actually, that the Soviets were getting ahead of us in terms of technological development and so forth. So I actually had my interest caught rather early by what was going on over in the Soviet Union. Sputnik baby, that's what I call myself, a Sputnik baby. Yes, please, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Liz Whitfield from the Carnegie Endowment, and I myself am also very much an optimist. But I wanted to ask you, as someone who's only been working in this field for about a year, I don't have the benefit of experience that you have. And of course, you know, young people like us, we can read about things in history textbooks, but it's easy to fall into the trap of thinking that that's how history would always turn out. And so I wanted to ask you, in your career, what things have you seen that give you reason for your continued optimism? Have you seen things happen that conventional wisdom held were impossible? Can you shed some light on that?
Yes, and the first was actually in the most recent period. The first was the New START Treaty, wherein you know, up until just days before it was ratified, the Senate voted to give its advice and consent. I had colleagues across the government telling me, "You're never going to get this thing done. It's never going to be passed." And during the course of the negotiations, I had people in the interagency constantly, I mentioned email, constantly communicating and saying, "You're never going to get this thing done." So that's why I mentioned the necessity of persistence. You know, you just have to keep your head down and keep working sometimes. It's a little bit of a sad example, but the other thing that gave me great hope back in the 1990s was the work that we did on the so-called trilateral deal with Ukraine, Russia, Kazakhstan, and Belarus to bring Soviet-era nuclear weapons back from those three countries to the Russian Federation for elimination, or in the case of the small number of mobile systems that came out of Belarus for redeployment. So I was a participant in that negotiation, and it was a successful one. Now, sadly, sorely undermined by the Russian action in Ukraine, its seizure of Crimea, an attempt to incorporate it into the Russian Federation. So, but nevertheless, as far as a signal success and achieving a stable outcome at the end of the Cold War, it could have been, we had terrible nightmares in 1991, 1992 that the dissolution of the Soviet Union would result in a nuclear bazaar where there would be everything available for sale and things would be falling into the hands of terrorists. So not only the action to denuclearize Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Belarus was successful, but since then, and I know you've had a lot of conversation about the advances of cooperative threat reduction, but the work that we did to bring fissile material and warheads into better control and accounting and protection in the former Soviet Union, those were all very good projects. Again, ones we could not have imagined back in the earlier era in the 1980s. So there's been a lot of experiences I've had in my career where, just keeping your head down and keeping working brings good results. That's why I never give up. Thank you. Yes, please.
Tira Shaya, Center for Nonproliferation Studies. One of my projects that I work on is the WMD free zone in the Middle East in Track 2 capacity, and I'm a part of Chen Kane's Middle East network of emerging specialists. And whenever people ask me about it, the first thing they say is, well, that's not going to happen, right? And a lot of older people even discourage me from working on it and say, shift your attention elsewhere. So as an optimist, would you say keep going on this track? Or go
Actually,
into business?
yes, I would, but I have some empirical data to back up what I have to say here. And I'm sure you remember the Acres process that basically halted in the mid-1990s amid crisis and troubles in the region. But in the period that we were preparing for this review conference and trying to convene this Weapons of Mass Destruction Free Zone conference on the Middle East, we started up a series of quiet and serious discussions that came to be called the Glion process because they took place in Glion for the first time since the Acres process, halted. We got the Arabs, the Israelis, and in at least one case, the Iranians, all to sit down and have a quiet and serious discussion about what it would take to really move forward on this profoundly important goal. So I know that the countries in the region can sit down and work together. And I know that there is potential for serious discussion and perhaps some progress. And by the way, I think in certain areas we can even see practical ways in which they are working together. I attended the so-called integrated field exercise for the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty Organization last December in Jordan. And there was a case where the Arabs and the Israelis and the Iranians were all participating in this on-site inspection exercise in Jordan and working together in practical ways to implement the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. So I think that we have some empirical data, not only the Glion process in terms of readiness for serious discussions, but also empirical data related to some practical problem solving that's going on. So I think we just have to continue to try to nurture developments in that area and further broaden the circle of countries in the Middle East who are interested in really trying to do some heavy lifting here. It's been very much an issue that Egypt has dominated. I don't know what role Iran is going to play in this upcoming period, but we will hope for more productive diplomacy going forward. And there are other countries, I think, prepared to step forward. I mentioned Jordan stepping forward to play this role for the IFE 14. We'll see what other countries will step up to the bar. But I definitely encourage you to continue.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Good afternoon, Madam Secretary. Taylor McDonald, University of Maryland.
Hi, Taylor.
So from your experience at in think tanks and with your knowledge background of nuclear strategy and other theories such as game theory, how does this work into your professional career as a representative and expert of nuclear policy for the United States, and how did this help you in the application of the New START Treaty?
I'm not a game theorist, but thank you, Taylor. Taylor's referring to some work I've been doing lately. I'm interested that we need to do some more work on deterrence theory And those of you who have studied this, you know that, of course, during the Cold War, there was a lot of work to develop game theory and the notion of the zero-sum game, and you know, what else supports the underpinnings of deterrence. Because there are so many players in the game now, South Asia, Iran, not Iran, sorry, I meant India. We're hoping Iran's going to be off the table here. India, Pakistan, and China in that dynamic, what role Russia's going to play. I've been looking at the evolution of game theory and how it might apply to, you know, helping us to think. It's not going to be a panacea answering with some kind of magic formula our questions here, but I think it can help us perhaps to elucidate some of the issues that are out there now to consider. So thanks for the reference, but I myself am no game theorist. That gets me back to Taylor's question, which is, I really believe in what Ellen Tauscher said this morning. It's very good in your careers going forward to try to be able to step in and step out of various experiences. She mentioned getting experience on the Hill. I certainly endorse that, although I've never had any experience on the Hill except all the times I get hauled up there to testify. I guess that counts as a certain kind of experience, but never worked up there. In any event, I really do believe that the role think tanks play is so important in our system, in our national kind of character, and in the way that we are international innovators, not only on things like technology, but also on the ideas front as well. I always feel like it's important. I'm one of those typical political appointees. I'm out of government during certain periods, and then I come back into government. But by the time you leave government, you're pretty worn out, and oftentimes your intellectual capital is spent. So to be able to go back to a think tank for a couple of years and have an opportunity to work on projects, to interact, to develop some new ideas, and to really, as I say, refill that stock of intellectual capital is very, very important. So as you contemplate your careers, think in those terms too. You know, what makes best sense for you. But I always say, never be worried to completely step out of your comfort zone and try something new and different, because it can be a surprising benefit to you. So, thanks. I think we might be approaching out of time, because I was told that we do have to wrap up in a timely manner. But thank you all very much, not only for listening to my speech, but also for coming to the conference. I hope I will see some of you at GW tomorrow for the academic day, and really, thanks for participating.